Hey guys, tonight we're stepping behind gilded gates and velvet ropes, past the polo ponies and the swan-filled lakes, and into the very private, very peculiar, frequently heartbreaking world of Princess Diana. Not the fairy tale version, not the tiara and the carriage and the world watching a young woman float down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral like something out of a dream. I mean the real Diana, the one who cried in the back of a limousine, ate chocolate biscuits alone in her apartment at midnight, and once hid from royal footmen behind a curtain because she genuinely didn't know what she was supposed to do next. But before we get into it, a massive, genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are. This kind of suggestion is exactly what shapes this channel, and honestly, I've been wanting to do this one for a while. If you enjoy what I do here, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you something. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always midnight somewhere, and somehow that's always where you all are. Also, we're now live on Spotify, links in the description if you want to make this part of your wind-down routine. Now, dim the lights, get the fan going, pull that blanket up to exactly the right height, you know the height, and let's just settle in. Because here's what I want you to think about before we begin. Have you ever wondered what it's actually like to live inside the most photographed life on Earth? What do you eat for breakfast when 200 journalists are camped outside your window? How do you raise two small boys in a palace where the heating doesn't work properly and nobody's allowed to hug you in public? What do you do when you realise somewhere between the wedding and the realisation that your husband still loves someone else? That the fairy tale was never real and there's no exit door? What was it like to be 20 years old, barely out of a flat share in Earl's Court, suddenly learning to curtsy to the Queen of England in your own home? Did she have friends? Real ones? Did she ever just want to sit in her pyjamas and watch terrible television without someone writing it down? Was she lonely? Was she funny? Was she, underneath all of it, just a person, complicated and stubborn and scared and kind, trying to figure out how to survive a life that nobody had built any instructions for? Congratulations! You've just woken up as Diana Spencer. The year is 1981. You are 19 years old. There is a crown somewhere in your future, a world watching your every breath, and absolutely nobody in the building who's going to tell you what comes next. Good luck. Before she was a princess, Diana Frances Spencer was just a girl growing up in the sprawling, drafty countryside of Norfolk, on an estate called Park House, which sat on the grounds of the Sandringham Royal Estate, which, if you think about it, is a rather on-the-nose preview of the life waiting for her. She was born on the 1st of July 1961, the third child of Viscount Althorp and Frances Roche, and from the very beginning her arrival was received with a kind of quiet, gentlemanly disappointment that only the British aristocracy can make feel like a weather forecast. Her parents had wanted a boy. They'd already had two girls. Diana arrived anyway, cheerful and unbothered, which was frankly very on brand. Park House itself was a 10-bedroom Georgian property on the Sandringham estate, which sounds impressive until you consider that it sat on rented land belonging to the royal family and that the royal family's actual house was a short walk away. So from birth, Diana lived literally adjacent to the institution that would one day consume her. This is either deeply symbolic or just geography, depending on how generous you're feeling. Her early years, by most accounts, were genuinely happy ones, in the way that childhoods can be happy when the unhappiness hasn't fully arrived yet. There were gardens to run through, a swimming pool that the neighbourhood children used in summer, pet animals, and the kind of English country freedom that involves mud and bicycles and not being asked where you've been. She had an older sister, Sarah, and an older brother, Charles, and a younger brother, John, who died just 10 hours after birth when Diana was barely 3, a loss the family absorbed in the particular silence that grief found in households like hers, which is to say it went underground and stayed there. She was, by all childhood accounts, a warm and anxious little girl at the same time, which sounds contradictory but isn't. She worried about the feelings of others in the specific way of someone who was already finely attuned to when the atmosphere in a room had changed, when someone was unhappy, when something had shifted that no one was talking about. She learned to read adults early, which is usually a sign that adults were not entirely reliable, and which would later become the skill that made her extraordinary in public and exhausted in private. She loved animals with the uncomplicated wholeheartedness that children do. She had guinea pigs, she had a cat. She collected soft toys with the dedication of someone building a community. She took swimming lessons, ballet classes and piano lessons, and was mediocre at most of them in the enthusiastic way of someone who was doing them because she liked them, rather than because she was going to be remembered for it. What she was already remarkable at, even then, was simply being present with people. Her childhood nanny, Mary Clark, later recalled that Diana at 7 or 8 had a quality of attentiveness that was unusual, that when she was with you, she was entirely with you, which sounds simple but is actually one of the rarer human qualities, and one that most people spend their whole lives not quite managing. She grew up knowing she was connected to something large and historical. The Spencer family had deep aristocratic roots, a family seat at Althorpe in Northamptonshire, ancestors who had served at court for generations. The Spencers were, in many ways, more ancient English nobility than the Windsors themselves, a fact that would sit quietly in Diana's understanding of herself, even in the years when the institution she married into treated her as though she were the outsider. She had no idea, playing in the garden at Park House in the 1960s, that the people whose estate she was borrowing a corner of would one day be her family. Nobody told her. Nobody could have predicted it. The life waiting for her was still decades away, entirely unwritten. She was just a child in Norfolk, collecting guinea pigs and worrying about other people's feelings. She was already, in the most essential way, entirely herself. If Diana's early childhood looked idyllic from the outside, rolling lawns, a swimming pool, pet guinea pigs with extravagant names, the interior of the Spencer household was considerably less pastoral. Her parents' marriage was a slow-motion collapse that finally gave way in 1967, when Diana was just 6 years old. Her mother Frances left, not just the marriage but the house, the children, the estate, and walked out into a new life with a wallpaper heir named Peter Shand Kidd. The courts, in the way courts did things in 1969 England, awarded custody to her father. Diana and her siblings stayed. Frances did not come back, and Diana, 6 years old, stood at the end of the driveway and listened for the sound of her mother's car returning long after it was gone. The divorce was bitter and public in the way that aristocratic divorces were in late 1960s England, meaning everyone knew about it, nobody discussed it, and the children were expected to absorb it quietly and get on with things. Diana's father, Johnny Spencer, was awarded custody partly on the testimony of Diana's maternal grandmother, who sided with her son-in-law against her own daughter in court. This is the kind of detail that sounds operatic until you consider that a 6-year-old girl was living inside it in real time, with no language to describe it and nowhere particular to put it. She later spoke of hearing her brother Charles crying at night in the room next to hers, and of not knowing what to do. She was 6 years old and already trying to manage someone else's pain, which is a rehearsal she would repeat in various configurations for the rest of her life. Her father eventually remarried, and the children acquired a stepmother, Rain, Countess of Dartmouth, whom they collectively and not affectionately nicknamed Acid Rain, and who was not, by most accounts, warmly maternal toward them. Diana described her stepmother's arrival as another displacement in a childhood that had already involved too many. The house changed. The atmosphere changed. The particular shape of home that children carry as their baseline shifted again. What the divorce did, the thing that is worth understanding if you want to understand Diana, was install in her a very specific and lifelong preoccupation with abandonment. Not the theoretical kind, the philosophical kind that comes from reading about it in a book. The practical, embodied kind that comes from being 6 years old and listening for a car that never comes back. She spent a significant portion of her adult life, in ways she recognized and ways she didn't, trying to secure the feeling that the people she loved were not about to leave. This is not an amateur diagnosis. Diana said it herself, in the tapes, in the interviews, in the late conversations with friends who wrote about it afterward. She was afraid of being left. She needed reassurance in quantities that the institution she married into was constitutionally unable to provide. She reached for people because reaching was what she had learned to do when the adults around her went quiet and the house got cold, and nobody explained what was happening. The interesting thing, the thing worth sitting with, is that the same wound that made her private life so difficult made her public life so extraordinary. The child who learned to read a room for signs of trouble became the adult who could walk into a hospital ward and know immediately who needed to be sat with, who was frightened, who needed someone to simply stay. The loss shaped the gift. That's not a comfortable thing, and it's not a tidy thing, but it's true. Diana was not, by any academic measure, a standout student. She failed her O-levels twice, which she later discussed with a kind of cheerful self-deprecation that made people adore her, as if failing an exam was simply another experience she'd collected along with everything else. What she excelled at even then was people. She was warm in a way that felt instinctive rather than performed, the kind of person who remembered your name and meant it when she asked how you were. At her boarding schools, first Riddlesworth Hall, then West Heath, she was known not for academic achievement, but for visiting elderly residents at a nearby nursing home on weekends, entirely of her own initiative, sitting with them and listening in a way that most adults in her life had never quite managed to do with her. Riddlesworth Hall was a prep school in Norfolk where Diana arrived at age 9, boarding during term time and returning home to a family situation that was still in the process of resolving itself in the unresolvable ways divorces involving children never fully resolve. By the accounts of those who knew her there, she was a gentle, popular, somewhat anxious girl who made friends easily and kept them well. She was good at swimming. She won a prize for helpfulness, which is either extremely sweet or slightly heartbreaking depending on what you know about the rest of the story. At West Heath, the secondary school in Kent she attended from age 12, the academic picture did not dramatically improve. She sat her O-levels and failed them. She sat them again and failed them again. Her teachers remembered her as bright but uninterested in the material, not incapable, just pointed somewhere else, the way some people simply are at school and spend years being made to feel deficient for it, before the world eventually catches up and admits that exams measure a fairly narrow slice of human intelligence. What West Heath did give her, or rather what she found for herself there, was the Saturday afternoon visits to Durrant Park Hospital and a local old people's home. She organised these herself, alongside a friend, without being required to. She would sit with elderly patients, hold their hands, talk to them, not in the performative way of someone fulfilling a community service requirement, but in the way of someone who genuinely preferred the company of people who needed company to almost anything else she could have been doing with a Saturday. She was also, at school, quietly funny. This is a detail that tends to get lost in the more tragic framing of her story, but it's worth keeping. She had a dry, self-deprecating humour that she kept fairly close, a way of making a face at the absurdity of something, a talent for a one-liner delivered so quietly it took a second to land. The girls she was close to at West Heath remembered the laughter as much as anything else. She left. School at 16 with no qualifications, which at the time seemed like a reasonably contained problem. She was the daughter of an earl. The path was presumed to involve a suitable marriage rather than a career, and in the meantime there was finishing school in Switzerland, which she attended for 6 weeks before deciding she had finished enough and returning to London. This was considered mildly eccentric at the time. In retrospect, it was the first clear signal of something that everyone around her consistently underestimated. Diana Spencer had a very clear sense of what she actually wanted, even when she had very little power to act on it. Before the palace swallowed her whole, Diana Spencer lived an almost comically normal life in a flat in Earl's Court, London, sharing with 3 flatmates, working as a kindergarten assistant at the Young England School in Pimlico, and occasionally cleaning other people's homes for extra money. She was 19, she had a bicycle, she wore normal clothes, she went to the grocery store, she ate chocolate biscuits with the lights off, not as a metaphor, just because she liked them and didn't particularly feel like turning the lights back on. The flat was small, the carpets were questionable, and nobody outside her immediate social circle had the faintest idea that she existed. She later described this period as the happiest of her adult life. That detail will not surprise you by the time we're done. The flat was in Coleherne Court, a mansion block in Earl's Court, which her parents helped her buy when she turned 18. She shared it with 3 friends, Carolyn Pride, Anne Bolton, and Virginia Pittman, and the arrangement was, by all accounts, genuinely happy in the specific way of young women sharing a small space with people they actually like. There were rules about the kitchen. There were conversations that went on too long, and glasses of wine and Sunday mornings, and the small domestic textures of a life that belonged entirely to her. She worked at the Young England kindergarten in Pimlico 2 or 3 mornings a week, where she was, by all accounts, a natural, patient, warm, good at getting down to the level of small children in the literal physical sense of crouching and kneeling and making herself less tall and less intimidating, which was something she would do for the rest of her life with people of all ages. She also worked some days for an American woman named Mary Robertson, helping look after her infant son, and did some cleaning work for her older sister Sarah. She was not at this point troubled by the relative ordinariness of her income. She was 19 and she liked her life. She cooked simple meals, she watched television, she slept well. She went out with friends to the cinema and to restaurants that were not particularly grand. She drove a mini metro and navigated London traffic with the specific cheerful aggression of someone who has only recently passed their test and is still finding it exciting. The photographers who would later make her life a documented continuous event had not yet discovered her. She moved through the city invisibly, which is not nothing. It is in fact a very great deal. There is something worth pausing on here, which is that Diana in this period was genuinely content. Not performing contentment, not managing distress with activity, not filling a gap actually, simply content. She had her friends, her work, her flat, her freedom to move through the world unobserved. She went to the supermarket and chose her own yogurt without anyone writing it down or photographing the yogurt and publishing the photograph with a caption about what it revealed about her state of mind. When Charles began calling and the courtship began to take shape and the extraordinary machinery of royal selection began to orient itself toward her, she stepped toward it. She was 19, she was romantic, and she had no framework for what she was walking into, because nobody who had ever walked into it had come back to tell her. The flat in Earl's Court was where she was fully herself, fully free, fully unobserved. She left it behind in 1981 and never entirely got it back, though she spent the rest of her life trying. The official courtship of Diana Spencer and Prince Charles lasted roughly 6 months, which by royal standards was practically a whirlwind, and by any other standard was not nearly enough time to marry someone you had met approximately 13 times. Charles, 32, and under increasing institutional pressure to select a suitable wife, and produce an heir before the nation collectively expired from suspense, had known Diana vaguely for years. She was the younger sister of a woman he had briefly dated. He began paying her more pointed attention in the summer of 1980, and by February of 1981, he proposed in the nursery at Windsor Castle. Diana said yes. She later admitted she wasn't entirely sure if she was in love or simply swept up in the dizzying unreality of the whole thing. The answer, with the benefit of hindsight, appears to have been the latter. Their first significant encounter, or rather the one that appears to have counted, was in a ploughed field at Althorpe in the summer of 1980, when Charles came to visit Diana's sister Sarah and encountered Diana instead, sitting in the field, and found her, in his words, jolly and bouncy. Diana was 18, Charles was 31. She found him glamorous in the way you find someone glamorous when you're 18 and have grown up adjacent to his family home, and they are the Prince of Wales. These are not the same as the foundations of a lasting marriage, but they are the foundations of a royal engagement, which is a slightly different thing. The courtship was conducted under conditions of extraordinary scrutiny. Photographers were stationed outside locations where Diana might emerge from the moment the press identified her as a serious candidate. She was followed, photographed, analysed. She handled it with a composure that impressed even experienced royal watchers. She never complained publicly, never snapped, deflected questions with a lightness that looked easy and was not. She was trained by nobody, which makes it more remarkable. She was simply very good instinctively at managing the space between herself and a camera. The 13 or so meetings that constituted their courtship were necessarily formal or semi-formal, or at least observed. A royal courtship in 1980 was not candlelit dinners where people stayed up too late talking. It was official engagements, weekend house parties with chaperones, evenings at the opera with other people present. They barely had time alone. The version of Charles that Diana fell for was, in many ways, a projection. The idea of him, the glamour of him, the significance of him, rather than the actual daily reality of a man who would turn out to prefer watercolours and Jungian philosophy and long solitary walks to the company of a young wife who needed warmth and presence and consistent attention. She talked about the proposal later. He rang her on his car phone, he was in Australia at the time, and told her he had something to ask her when he returned. When he got back, they sat in the nursery at Windsor, and he asked, and she laughed. Her first reaction was laughter, which she then suppressed into something more appropriate, which is itself a small compressed preview of the next decade. She asked for time to think. He gave her a weekend. She said yes on Monday. Several of her friends advised against it. She went ahead anyway, which in retrospect is either brave or heartbreaking depending on the day. When the engagement was announced on the 24th of February 1981, Diana Spencer walked out in front of the world's press, wearing a powder blue suit and the expression of someone who had just agreed to something enormous and was only now beginning to understand what it was. She was 19 years old. The photographers numbered in the dozens. The questions were polite on the surface and ravenous underneath. When a journalist asked the couple if they were in love, Diana said yes, immediately, brightly. Charles said, and this is a direct quote that has lived rent-free in the cultural consciousness for 40 years, whatever in love means. Diana's smile, already a thing of careful training, did not waver. She was going to need that skill. The suit was her own. She had bought it herself, off the rack, in the straightforward way of someone who had not yet understood that every garment she put on her body would henceforth be documented, analysed, and reproduced in print with a level of attention more commonly reserved for diplomatic cables. It was a fine suit. It was slightly too big, because she had lost weight in the weeks leading up to the announcement under the specific stress of being kept a secret while the world tried very hard to find out the secret. It is notable that the first thing most people noticed about the engagement photograph was not the ring, a large oval sapphire surrounded by diamonds, chosen by Diana from a catalogue, which was itself considered slightly unorthodox but the gap at the waistband. The announcement was made in the court circular, the official record of royal engagements, and also by the palace press office, and Diana was thrust immediately into the full machinery of public royal life with a preparation period that could be generously described as minimal. She had no media training. She had no official briefing on what to say or not say. She had in her corner her family's aristocratic background and her own considerable natural instincts. And that was essentially it. The press response was immediate and overwhelming and largely delighted. She was young, she was pretty, she was charming, she was English, ticking boxes that hadn't all been ticked simultaneously in a royal match for some time. The tabloids fell on her with the specific enthusiasm of publications that have just found a story they intend to run for the foreseeable future. Every photograph was examined. Her past was reconstructed. Her flatmates were interviewed. Her former teachers were located and asked to comment. A portrait of a young woman assembled from fragments by people who had never met her began to take shape in the press, and Diana, the actual three-dimensional chocolate biscuit-eating Diana, had almost nothing to do with it. She said later that she went from nobody to everybody overnight and had no way of processing the speed of it. One day she was cycling to work in Pimlico. 2 weeks later she was on the front page of every newspaper in the country. The engagement had lasted a morning. The consequences were already permanent. The powder blue suit was photographed from approximately 40 angles and appeared in publications across the world, and somewhere in the back of that official photograph, behind the smile that didn't waver, was a 19-year-old trying to keep up with something that was already moving faster than she could run. Sometime between the engagement and the wedding, Diana moved into Buckingham Palace, which is exactly as strange as it sounds. She was 19, she had never lived alone, and she was now rattling around one of the largest and most formal buildings in the world with a staff who addressed her formally, corridors that seemed to have been designed specifically to disorient, and a fiancé who was, for much of the time, somewhere else. There were no friends allowed to simply pop round. There was no popping anywhere. The palace ran on schedules and protocol and a very specific set of unspoken rules that nobody sat Diana down and explained, in large part because it had never occurred to anyone that they needed to. She described the period as catastrophically lonely. She once said she cried every day. The staff brought her meals on trays. She ate them alone. Buckingham Palace contains over 700 rooms, which sounds like something out of a fairy tale until you're 19 years old, and living in it by yourself and realizing that 700 rooms means 700 opportunities to get lost, to turn a corner and find another corridor identical to the last one, to understand in a very physical way that the building was not designed around the comfort of any particular person. It was designed around the performance of an institution. The person living in it was incidental to that purpose. Her days had a shape, but the shape was formal and managed rather than warm. There were fittings for the wedding dress which took months and involved many visits to the Emmanuel atelier and the particular sustained anxiety of a dress that had to be perfect under the gaze of 750 million people. There were lessons, etiquette, protocol, the management of public engagements, delivered in the manner of an educational program designed for someone expected to absorb information quietly and not ask too many questions about why. There were official engagements, introductions, the long process of being presented and assessed. Charles was away for much of it. He had his own schedule, his own commitments, his own life that had been fully formed before Diana entered it, and which her arrival had not fundamentally reorganised. This was not, in his understanding, neglect. It was simply how things were. He had never known any other configuration. In Diana's understanding, it was the familiar childhood sensation of the adults going away and the house going quiet, and it landed in exactly the place it always had. She asked for her flatmates to be allowed to come and stay. The answer was no, or something so hedged with difficulty as to amount to no. She asked to be allowed to return to her flat occasionally. This was also complicated in the way that everything was complicated once you were inside the institution. She was not technically a prisoner. The door was not locked, but the weight of expectation, of propriety, of what was done and not done, was its own kind of containment. She lost more weight. The dress fittings became a record of it, the measurements reducing over the months as the wedding approached. She was not eating well. She was not sleeping well. She was 19 years old in an enormous formal building being prepared for the most watched event of the decade, and she later said that the only people she felt fully comfortable with during this period were the staff, the footmen, the maids, the people who brought the trays, because they were kind to her without wanting anything from her, which was rarer in that building than it should have been. The 29th of July, 1981, was watched by an estimated 750 million people around the world, which remains one of the most watched television broadcasts in history, and is the kind of statistic that makes the human brain go briefly offline. Diana arrived at St. Paul's Cathedral in the glass coach wearing a gown designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, ivory silk taffeta with a 25-foot train, the longest in royal wedding history, which meant it spent most of the journey to the altar slightly crumpled, a detail Diana found quietly mortifying. The night before, she discovered a bracelet Charles planned to give to Camilla Parker Bowles. She told a friend. She got in the carriage anyway. Somewhere in the middle of the ceremony, she transposed two of Charles's names during the vows, and managed to look as though she had intended to do it. The dress had been kept secret with a diligence that would have been impressive applied to matters of actual national security. The Emanuel studio was locked. Staff had signed confidentiality agreements. Sketches were kept in a safe. When Diana finally stepped out of the glass coach at St. Paul's and the dress was revealed to the world, it produced a collective intake of breath that was audible on television recordings if you turned the volume up. It was enormous and romantic and entirely of its moment. Enormous puffed sleeves, a bodice heavily worked with hand embroidery, and 10,000 mother-of-pearl sequins, the 25-foot train following her like a declaration. It had also, as noted, crumpled in transit, and the careful pressing it had received that morning had not entirely survived the journey, which Diana noticed immediately and filed away in the part of her mind that catalogued the gap between how things were supposed to be and how they actually were. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Her father, Johnny Spencer, had suffered a serious stroke 3 years earlier and had recovered well, but walked with a slight unsteadiness that Diana matched her pace to, gently, barely visibly, in the way of someone very used to adjusting her speed to the person beside her. It was a small thing. It was entirely her. The ceremony was conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Diana said her vows clearly, then transposed Charles's names. Philip Charles Arthur George became Charles Philip, then corrected herself, then smiled, and the congregation smiled back, and it became the human moment of the ceremony, the moment where the marble and the grandeur gave way briefly to something recognizable. She was nervous. Of course she was nervous. She was 20 years old and getting married in front of the world. What she knew on that morning was more than the official record suggested. She knew about Camilla. She had known for some time. She had confronted her feelings about it and made the decision, conscious or otherwise, that the dream of what was possible was still worth the reality of what was already true. She said later in the tapes that she thought she could change things, that youth and proximity and love, if she was patient enough, would be enough. She was wrong, but she didn't know that yet. The carriage waited. The dress was crumpled. The world was watching. She went in anyway. The royal honeymoon took place first aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia in the Mediterranean, and then at Balmoral, the Scottish Highland estate that the royal family treats as a holiday destination, and which Diana experienced as something closer to a cold, windswept endurance test. Charles brought books, many books. He read them. He painted watercolours. He fished for hours in the silence of rivers, communing peacefully with nature, entirely content. Diana, who had expected a honeymoon to involve at minimum a reasonable amount of her new husband's attention, found herself adrift. She was not a reader, not a painter, not a person who found solitude in the Highlands restorative. She found it cold and quiet and full of the specific loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people while still being entirely on your own. The Britannia portion was, relatively speaking, the better half. The yacht was a floating palace, over 400 naval personnel, formal dinners, the warm Mediterranean Sea visible from every porthole. Diana had her own rooms, Charles had his. The ship stopped at various ports along the coast of France, Italy and Greece, and Diana went ashore and was photographed looking radiant in a way that photographs of people on their honeymoon generally require, but which takes considerable effort when you're 20 years old, newly married, and quietly beginning to understand that the person you married is still thinking about someone else. She said later that Camilla's name came up more than once during those first weeks. A photograph fell out of Charles's diary, a photograph of Camilla. He wore a pair of cufflinks she'd given him. These are small things in isolation. They accumulate into something considerably less small when you're 3 weeks into a marriage and have not yet developed the emotional vocabulary or the practical standing to say directly what you mean. Diana was 20. She was new. She did not yet know her own position well enough to defend it. Balmoral in August is, by the standards of most 20-year-olds, not an obvious choice for romance. It is 50,000 acres of Scottish highland, much of it heather and grouse moorland, with a castle at the centre that is cold even in summer and decorated in the specific Victorian tartan palette that Queen Victoria installed and nobody has since been quite confident enough to remove. The royal family loves it. It is where they are most themselves, outdoors, walking, shooting, fishing, breathing the cold air with the contentment of people who find this genuinely restorative. Diana did not find it genuinely restorative. She found it cold and long and quiet in ways she had not planned for. She had no role on a fishing riverbank. She had no natural involvement in a grouse shoot. She sat and she waited, and she watched her husband and her new family move through an environment they inhabited entirely comfortably, while she orbited it from outside trying to find a foothold. She cried. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. She was already, by the testimony she would give years later, beginning to feel the first authentic shape of what her life was going to be. And yet she told no one. She was a princess now. There was a version of the story that the world needed, and she understood that clearly enough, even then. The photographs from Balmoral showed a young couple in Barber jackets on a riverbank, squinting into the Highland sun, smiling. They are convincing photographs. That was already her job. From the moment the engagement was announced, Diana was followed. Not occasionally, not on significant occasions, constantly, relentlessly, as though the world had decided collectively that her face was public property, and her privacy was a technicality that didn't really need to be honoured. Photographers camped outside her kindergarten, her flat, her car. They waited outside restaurants and shop doors. They chased her on bicycles. Early in the engagement, before she had fully understood what she was dealing with, she occasionally stopped to talk to them, even smiled, even joked, a reflex she had to train herself out of because warmth, she learned quickly, would always be used against her. By the time she became Princess of Wales, she was being photographed approximately every time she left a building, and several times she did not. The scale of the press interest in Diana was, even by the standards of the already feverish British tabloid culture of the 1980s, exceptional. She was young, photogenic, accessible. She moved through public spaces rather than between cordoned official events, and she generated in photographs a quality that editors recognised and could not entirely explain. Something happened to a photograph when Diana was in it. She looked directly at the camera in a way that most public figures have been trained out of, and the direct gaze caught and held read as intimacy. Millions of people felt, looking at a photograph of Diana, that she was looking at them. This is technically an illusion, and emotionally entirely real. The tabloid press of the 1980s was not an institution known for its restraint, and the years of Diana's marriage coincided with the peak of a particular kind of royal journalism that operated on the assumption that the private lives of the royals were a form of public entertainment to which readers had an implicit entitlement. Editors competed for exclusives. Photographers competed for the defining image. Sources within the household, staff, associates, people who had spoken to people who had spoken to people, were cultivated and paid. The result was a coverage machine of enormous reach and almost no accountability. Diana learned its logic by living inside it. She learned which photographers were reasonable and which were not. She learned how a photograph could be taken out of context, how an expression caught between two other expressions could be made to mean something it didn't mean, how a story with a kernel of truth could be built into a narrative with no ceiling. She learned that a warm word with a photographer would appear in the following morning's paper as evidence of her accessibility, and that a cold word would appear as evidence of her difficulty. She also gradually learned to use it, not immediately, not clumsily, but with the developing precision of someone who has been studied long enough to understand the studying. She understood that the press was both her greatest torment and the only real leverage she had against the institution that contained her. The palace could not touch her in a newspaper photograph. She was, in print, the people's princess long before anyone used the phrase, and the palace understood that her public image was a kind of power it could not simply revoke. This understanding would shape the years of the marriage's dissolution, the Morton book, the Panorama interview, everything that came later. But that came later. In the early years, it was simply the cameras, everywhere, always. The flash in the corner of every vision, the click she fell asleep to and woke to, the world watching every single breath. Whatever was happening inside the marriage, whatever was unravelling behind the palace walls, the public didn't see it, or didn't want to. What they saw was Diana, in the crowd, bending down to speak to a child, holding someone's hand at a hospital bedside, pressing her forehead gently against someone who was dying, looking genuinely moved by strangers in a way that royal protocol had never made room for before. She broke the rule, unspoken but absolute, that royals don't touch. She shook hands without gloves. She knelt. She crouched. She held people. This was considered, in certain quarters of the palace, faintly alarming. To the rest of the world, it was the whole point. The rule about gloves was not written down anywhere. It didn't need to be. The royal family had maintained a physical distance from the public for generations, not out of coldness exactly, but out of the institutional understanding that proximity creates complication, that touch implies equality, that the monarch and her family were set apart by something more than circumstance. You shook hands formally, you smiled, you moved on. The engagement was brief and managed, and the distance was maintained. This was how it had always been done, and how it was expected to continue. Diana did not continue it. Whether this was instinct or quiet rebellion, or simply the behaviour of someone who had not yet fully absorbed the protocol, the effect was the same. On her first royal walkabout in Wales in the autumn of 1981, she broke away from the formal route and went toward the crowd rather than along it. She stopped. She crouched to speak to a child at knee height. She took the child's hand. She stayed long enough for the conversation to be real. The crowd, which had been performing the role of respectful admirers at a safe distance, became something different, became people who were being spoken to directly by someone who appeared to mean it. The photographs from that walkabout travelled around the world. The instinct it documented toward people rather than away from them, at their level rather than above it, became the signature of her public presence. She did it consistently, across 15 years, in dozens of countries, in circumstances that range from carefully managed royal tours to the AIDS ward at Middlesex Hospital, where she sat at a dying man's bedside and held his hand and looked at him directly and did not appear for even a moment to want to be anywhere else. This was not performance, or it was not only performance. The people she sat with, the dying, the sick, the homeless, the children, the elderly in care homes were not, as a rule, part of any official itinerary that required her presence with them. She sought them out. She returned. She remembered names and asked about family members and followed up, which are not the behaviours of someone managing optics. They are the behaviours of someone who finds people genuinely interesting and genuinely important. The public felt this. The public felt it in the specific way that people always feel the difference between being seen and being processed, between a smile that lands and a smile that travels the room. Diana's attention, when it was on you, was entire. Former patients, former residents of shelters and hospices, people who met her in corridors of hospitals or on the edges of official engagements, consistently described the same experience. She made you feel, for the duration of her attention, that you were the only person in the building. The crowds that lined the streets on her tours, the hundreds of thousands in Australia, the vast turnouts in America, the people who waited hours on pavements in the rain for 3 seconds of proximity, were not simply responding to celebrity. They were responding to the sensation, communicated through photographs and footage and the accounts of those who had met her, that she was paying attention in a way that mattered. In an era of increasing media noise and increasing institutional distance, that was not a small thing. It was, for many people, everything. When Prince William was born on the 21st of June 1982, Diana did something that caused a minor tremor in royal protocol. She took an active, present, non-delegated interest in her child. She breastfed. She chose William's nanny herself. She took him on royal tours instead of leaving him behind. She drove him to school in a normal car and collected him herself. When Harry arrived 2 years later, she did it all again, louder. She took them to McDonald's, she took them to theme parks, she took them to homeless shelters and hospitals so that they would understand early that the world outside their world existed and mattered. She sat with them at bedtime and read to them, and held them the way she had never been quite held enough herself. The royal tradition into which William and Harry were born had a fairly clear template for the raising of royal children. Nannies, nurseries, formal meal times, limited access to parents whose schedules were managed by the institution rather than by the children's needs. Charles himself had been raised largely within this template, warmly enough, by his own account, but with the particular emotional reserve of a household in which demonstrative affection was not the primary language. He turned out fine, in the institutional sense of the word fine. Diana had a different definition. She intervened at the level of the nanny first. She selected Barbara Barnes over the more traditional choice. Barnes was warm, informal, not a uniformed matron, and she made clear from the beginning that she intended to be present in her children's daily lives in ways that the system had not historically required of a princess. She was there for the bath times. She was there for the bedtime stories. She was there in the morning in her dressing gown, which was not how these things were generally done, and she did not appear to care that it was not how these things were generally done. The school decision was deliberate and carefully considered. She wanted William and Harry in schools with other children, real children, children who would treat them as people rather than as titles. William started at Mrs. Minor's nursery school, and then Wetherby pre-prep, both in London, both ordinary. Harry followed the same path. Diana drove them herself when she could. She stood in the playground with the other parents and chatted and did not appear to find this remarkable, even though by any objective measure, a Princess of Wales standing in a school playground making small talk with other parents was, institutionally speaking, fairly remarkable. The trips to McDonald's and the theme parks were her answer to the question of how you raise children who understand normal life when their own life is profoundly abnormal. She took them on the tube. She took them to queue for things. She wanted them to understand what it felt like to wait, to be in a crowd, to navigate a world that did not part for you automatically. She understood, in the way of someone who had been removed from normal life abruptly and permanently, that the loss of it was not nothing. She was also, by the accounts of those who observed it, simply good at it, at motherhood in the daily, unglamorous, present tense sense. She was funny with them. She was affectionate in a physical, unguarded way. She wrestled with them and laughed too loudly and let them eat things they probably shouldn't have, and sat on the floor with them and was by every visible measure more comfortable in that role than in almost any other role her life required her to play. She told friends that her children were the thing she had done that she was most certain about. Everything else, the marriage, the institution, the public life, was contested, complicated, managed. Her boys were not. They were just hers. The marriage of Charles and Diana produced 2 sons, a global fascination, and a level of mutual incomprehension that was probably apparent within weeks of the honeymoon, and absolutely certain within a year. They were, at a fundamental level, mismatched, in age, in temperament, in emotional vocabulary, in what they wanted from a life together. Charles was private, intellectual, emotionally reserved in the manner of someone raised in an institution that treated personal feeling as a private matter best kept that way. Diana was emotional, expressive, needy in the straightforward way of someone who had grown up in a home where love was unreliable and had never quite stopped looking for it. They were each, in their own way, doing their best. It wasn't enough. The age gap was 13 years, which in some configurations means very little, and in this one meant a great deal. Charles had a fully formed adult life by the time Diana entered it. His friendships, his intellectual interests, his private routines, his emotional landscape. Diana was 19 and still in the process of assembling herself. She was flexible and adaptive in the ways that young people are, which is to say she was prepared to reshape around him, and he was, by the time they married, too settled in his own shape to do much reshaping at all. This is not a villain story. It is simply the story of 2 people who should not have married each other, trying to make the best of the fact that they had. The formal architecture of their marriage was not, by royal standards, unusual. Separate schedules, separate engagements, separate staff in many respects, coming together for official duties and family occasions and the managed performance of a united front. This is how it worked. It had always worked like this. Charles accepted it as the natural condition of a royal marriage. Diana experienced it as evidence of something wrong, something withheld, something she kept trying to fix by being more present and more expressive and more everything, which made her feel more desperate and made him feel more crowded, which is one of the neater descriptions of an incompatibility spiral. They had moments. People who were present at Highgrove in the early years of the marriage described occasions where they were genuinely warm together, where the laughter was real, where the gap between the public face and the private one briefly closed. Diana could make Charles laugh. Charles could be, in his reserved way, genuinely kind to her. These moments existed. They were also not enough to build a marriage on, or not enough once the structural pressures of the institution and the third party of Camilla and Diana's own intensifying despair began to close in. She demanded more than he knew how to give. He withdrew in the face of demand, which made her demand more. She called his friends and asked them what was wrong, what she had done, what she could do differently, which made him feel his privacy was not secure, which made him withdraw further. The household at Kensington Palace and Highgrove became a place of careful management, staff navigating between two people who occupied the same life and increasingly did not know how to speak to each other. By the mid-1980s, by most accounts, the marriage was a formal arrangement more than an emotional reality. They continued to appear together. They continued to produce the documentation of a functioning royal couple, smiles at official engagements, the right photographs, the right words. Privately, the distance was large and growing. Diana described this period in the tapes as the loneliest of her life, not in spite of being surrounded by people, but because of it. A crowded loneliness, which is the specific kind, is the worst kind. Bulimia nervosa is not a topic that featured heavily in the official royal narrative of the 1980s, which is part of why Diana's later disclosure that she had struggled with it throughout much of her marriage, beginning almost immediately after the engagement, landed the way it did. She described it in her own words in the tape she made for Andrew Morton's biography. The binging and purging, the self-harm, the days when it happened 4 or 5 times. She described it as a way of managing pain she had no other outlet for, a way of feeling some control in a life that felt almost entirely beyond her. The palace's response during the years it was happening ranged from dismissive to actively unhelpful. She was told more than once that she was being difficult. The weight loss that was visible from the engagement onward, the measurements reducing at each wedding dress fitting, the powder blue suit too large at the waist, was not, at the time, understood as a symptom of anything beyond pre-wedding nerves and a young woman watching her figure. This was 1981. The clinical understanding of bulimia was not yet widely established in public discourse. The behaviours that would later be recognised as characteristic, the cycles, the secrecy, the physical toll, were not in that context being read as an illness. They were being read as temperament, as sensitivity, as the general difficulty of a young woman who was not quite settling in the way everyone had hoped. Diana described the progression clearly in the tapes. It began around the time of the engagement. The stress was enormous, and she had no adequate way to process it. No therapist, no informed support, no language within the institution for what she was experiencing. She found that purging offered a brief and illusory feeling of release, of control, of having done something in a life that felt entirely managed by forces outside herself. The illness became, in her description, a companion and a coping mechanism, and a cage simultaneously, something that helped in the short term and consumed her in the long term, the way coping mechanisms that don't actually cope tend to do. The physical effects were apparent to those around her. She was very thin. She was at times visibly unwell. Staff noticed, members of the family noticed. The institutional response was to address it obliquely or not at all, in the manner of an organisation that had no framework for mental health and no great appetite for developing one. She was told she looked too thin on occasion, in the way people tell someone they look too thin when they don't want to address why. She was not, for a long time, given access to the kind of clinical support that might have helped. She sought help on her own eventually. Therapists, doctors, practitioners of various disciplines over the years, with varying degrees of success. She described the recovery as long and non-linear. with periods of real improvement and periods of relapse, particularly during the most difficult phases of the marriage. She was frank, in later years, about the complexity of it, that it wasn't simply about food, that it was never simply about food, that it was about the management of pain in a context where the pain had no socially acceptable outlet. What she did, eventually with the experience, was characteristic of her. She talked about it publicly in the Panorama interview, at a time when eating disorders were still heavily stigmatized, and the association with royal glamour and privilege made the disclosure doubly unexpected. Letters arrived afterward in their thousands from women who had never told anyone, who had watched the interview alone in their living rooms and felt for the first time that their experience had been named by someone who understood it from the inside. This was what she did with the things that hurt her. She turned them outward and let them be useful. Diana's relationship with clothes was not, as it was sometimes characterized, simple vanity. It was more deliberate than that, she understood, with the precision of someone who had learned to read a room at a very young age, that what she wore was always being read, and she got quite good at writing with it. Early in her royal life, the clothes were overseen, approved, managed. She wore what was selected, which leaned heavily toward florals and frills and a general aesthetic of unthreatening sweetness. As she grew more confident and more clearly embattled, the clothes changed. They became sharper, more modern, more herself. And then there was the 1994 interview night, the night Charles publicly admitted his affair, when Diana walked out wearing a short black Christina Stambolian dress that she had owned for 3 years and deliberately chosen not to wear until that specific evening. The fashion press called it the revenge dress. They were not wrong. The early wardrobe, the pie crust collars, the sailor suits, the pastel coordinates, was not entirely her choice. She was 19 and newly royal, and the people around her had opinions about what a Princess of Wales was supposed to look like, which was largely the opinion that she was supposed to look unthreatening, English, traditional, and not too interesting. She wore what she was advised to wear and looked pretty in it, and the public approved, because the public in 1981 wanted a fairy tale princess, and fairy tale princesses wore pie crust collars. She was working with designers from early on, Victor Edelstein, Catherine Walker, who became arguably her most important long-term fashion relationship. Walker designed for Diana for over 15 years and understood, with increasing precision, what Diana was trying to communicate at any given moment. The clothes evolved alongside Diana's understanding of her own situation, toward cleaner lines, stronger colours, a more European elegance that reflected the continental education she had absorbed as a teenager, and that the early royal styling had deliberately suppressed. The Versace years came later, in the post-separation period, when the formal constraints on her wardrobe loosened along with the formal constraints on her life. She wore shorter hems, she wore bold colours, she wore things that were undeniably glamorous in a way that was not the managed, approved glamour of an official consort, but the personal, decided glamour of someone who had figured out what she looked like and was no longer asking anyone's permission to look like it. The evening of the 29th of June, 1994, the night Charles's documentary Confession aired, Diana attended a function at the Serpentine Gallery in a black cocktail dress that she had purchased from Christina Stambolian and kept in her wardrobe unused for 3 years, having been previously advised it was too daring for a princess. She wore it that night. The photographs ran in every paper the following morning alongside the coverage of Charles's admission. The juxtaposition was not accidental. She looked extraordinary. She knew she looked extraordinary. That was entirely the point, and it was executed with a precision that would have impressed any general. She understood that clothes were the one form of communication she could deploy entirely on her own terms, without a speechwriter or an advisor or an institutional approval process. Every hemline, every neckline, every colour was a sentence. By the end, she was writing in paragraphs. Camilla Parker Bowles had been part of Charles's life before Diana entered it, during the engagement, throughout the marriage, and after. Diana knew this. She was aware of the bracelet before the wedding. She'd seen the engraving. She'd sat on the other end of telephone calls she was not supposed to know about. In the tapes made for Andrew Morton, she described the situation with a frankness that the establishment found deeply inconvenient. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. The line became one of the most quoted of the century. The equanimity with which she delivered it, dry, precise, a half smile, concealed the years of hurt underneath, but it also reflected something real. By that point, Diana had stopped drowning in it and started documenting it instead. Charles and Camilla had met in 1971. Their relationship was interrupted by Charles's naval career, by Camilla's marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973, by the various demands of their respective lives, but it was never entirely concluded. It continued in some form through the years of Charles's marriage to Diana, and Diana knew it, and this knowledge was the background radiation of her entire marriage, present in every room even when unspoken, affecting everything even when invisible. She confronted Camilla directly, once, at a birthday party in the early 1990s. The account of this confrontation, which Diana gave in the tapes, and which has been corroborated by others present, is a remarkable document of someone finally deciding to say the thing that had been unsaid for a decade. She asked Camilla directly to stop the affair. Camilla's response, as Diana described it, was dismissive, a suggestion that Diana had everything, had the children, had Charles. Diana said quietly and clearly that she had nothing. Then she left the party. It was not by any measure a victory, but it was the moment she stopped pretending she didn't know what she knew. The difficulty of her position was not simply emotional, but structural. She had married into an institution that had, for centuries, treated the personal lives of its members as entirely separate from their public duties. Affairs were not invented by Charles. They were a fairly standard feature of aristocratic marriage going back several generations, conducted with the discretion that the institution required and regarded as a private matter that had no bearing on official function. Diana's refusal to accept this framework, her insistence that the marriage meant what she had understood it to mean when she entered it, was experienced by those around her as a kind of naivety, and later as a kind of inconvenience. She was not naive. She'd understood the arrangement well enough to feel its injustice acutely. What she refused to accept was the institutional instruction to absorb that injustice silently, to perform contentment while quietly managing devastation, to be, in the words of one of the more cutting phrases of the era, a good sport. She was not a good sport. She was a person who had been badly hurt and who increasingly saw no good reason to pretend otherwise. The tapes, the Morton book, the Panorama interview, these were not the acts of someone out of control. They were the acts of someone who had finally decided that the record should reflect what had actually happened, and who was prepared to be the one to set it straight. Diana's mental health struggles during the 1980s were not, by any reasonable standard, subtle. She was self-harming. She was crying in public on royal tours. She was, by her own account, throwing herself down a staircase during a pregnancy in a desperate, chaotic attempt to get her husband's attention. She sought help from various professionals over the years with mixed results. What she rarely received from the institution she had married into was acknowledgement that anything was wrong. The prevailing institutional attitude seemed to be that the correct response to emotional suffering was to tidy it away, schedule around it, and hope that it resolved itself without anyone having to discuss it. It did not resolve itself. She described several incidents of self-harm in the tapes, cutting her arms and legs with a penknife, on one occasion cutting herself with a lemon slicer. Occasions when the pain felt less manageable inside than it would on the outside, where at least it was legible. She described these not with drama, but with the flat explanatory tone of someone recounting events they have processed enough to describe clearly, which is itself a form of recovery. She said she was not trying to kill herself. She said she was trying to communicate, to make something internal external, to create evidence of suffering in a context where suffering was being ignored. The staircase incident occurred during her pregnancy with William. She was in distress. She had tried to communicate the distress and had not been heard, and she threw herself down the stairs at Sandringham. Charles's response, as she described it, was to look at her with incomprehension and then leave the room to go riding. She was examined by doctors and the baby was unharmed. No further action was taken in the sense of anyone sitting down and addressing what was actually happening to her. The schedule continued. She saw various professionals over the years: psychiatrists, therapists, hypnotherapists, astrologers, practitioners of alternative therapies of various kinds, assembling a support system from the outside since the institution provided nothing from within. Some helped more than others. She was, by her own account, a difficult patient in the early years, resistant to the idea that her problems were hers rather than external, more comfortable with crisis than with the slow work of change. She improved, unevenly, over time. What the institution consistently failed to provide was the most basic element of support, which is acknowledgement. The response to Diana's distress was, repeatedly, to manage the symptoms rather than the cause, to adjust the schedule when she was too unwell to maintain it, to pass information about her state through intermediaries rather than address it directly, to treat her suffering as a logistical problem rather than a human one. She was 20 years old and then 25 and then 30, and in all that time the institution she lived inside could not find its way to saying simply and directly, "Something is wrong and we would like to help." This is not, to be entirely fair, uniquely the failing of the royal household. This was the 1980s. Mental health literacy in Britain was not what it is now. These conversations were not happening in most households, let alone in one with the specific constraints of the monarchy. But the failure matters. It matters because the person on the receiving end of it spent years without adequate support for a suffering that was real and that was treatable, and that shaped every year of her adult life. Between 1981 and 1992, Diana undertook dozens of official royal tours to Australia, Canada, Japan, the United States, across Africa, across the Middle East, standing in the heat or the cold or the relentless flash of cameras, shaking hands, attending banquets, cutting ribbons, visiting hospitals, wearing the right clothes, saying the appropriate things, being magnificent at the exact job she had never formally been trained for. The tours that became legendary were the ones where she connected with people in ways that transcended the official itinerary. In Australia in 1983, the crowds turned out for her in numbers that faintly alarmed Charles. In the United States in 1985, she danced with John Travolta at the White House and became, for approximately 48 hours, the most photographed person on Earth, which was already a pretty competitive field. The 1983 Australia tour was the first major international tour undertaken with baby William, whose presence Diana had insisted on against considerable institutional resistance. She was not leaving her 7-month-old son in England for 6 weeks because the schedule required it. She found a compromise. William would be based in New Zealand with his nanny, and Diana would visit between engagements. It was not ideal, and she knew it wasn't ideal, and she did it anyway because it was better than the alternative. On the first public walkabout in Sydney, the crowds were simply enormous. Hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets, many of them clearly and specifically there for her rather than for the tour in general. Charles, who was used to being the primary object of public interest, was visibly and understandably surprised. This became a recurring feature of their tours. The crowds wanted Diana. The Japan tour of 1986 is remembered partly for the photographs of Diana sitting alone at the foot of a monument, while Charles stood some distance away, and the two of them inhabiting the same official frame with the body language of strangers. These photographs circulated widely and were read accurately as evidence of a marriage in serious difficulty. The tour continued. The photographs continued. The gap between the official narrative and the visual record widened. The American visit of 1985, the Washington trip with the White House dinner hosted by Ronald and Nancy Reagan, produced the Travolta moment, which became one of the defining images of the decade. Diana danced with John Travolta, and then with Neil Diamond, and then with Clint Eastwood, and was in every photograph incandescent in a way that had nothing to do with the official purpose of the visit. She was 24, and she was in a ballroom and the cameras were entirely focused on her, and she was, for those hours, simply having a wonderful time. The photographs showed it. Charles was also in Washington on that trip. The photographs from his portion of the evening were considerably less widely reproduced. She was also, on every tour, doing the substantive work she was there to do, visiting hospitals and community projects and schools, going off itinerary to sit with people in ways that were not on the schedule and were entirely her, bringing the full attention that was her most extraordinary professional quality to room after room of strangers who left the encounter having been, briefly and genuinely, seen. That was the tour nobody particularly photographed. It was also the tour that mattered. In 1992, Andrew Morton published a book called Diana, Her True Story, which landed in the British press like a very specific kind of bomb, the kind that looks harmless from the outside and then detonates the entire surrounding landscape. The book, which appeared to draw on sources close to Diana, described the eating disorder, the self-harm, the crying jags, the loneliness, the three-person marriage. The palace was not pleased. The establishment responded in the manner that powerful establishments typically respond to devastating disclosures, by suggesting that the person making them was unstable. What they did not know at the time, what the world would not learn until after Diana's death, was that the source for the book was Diana herself, recorded over hours of secret sessions onto cassette tapes, speaking directly into a recorder in the deliberate, careful voice of someone who had decided that the record needed setting straight. The tapes were made in the autumn and winter of 1991. Diana recorded them at Kensington Palace, alone, using a standard cassette recorder. She answered questions from Morton that had been sent to her through a trusted intermediary, Dr. James Colthurst, a mutual friend who would deliver the questions, collect the tapes and carry them to Morton, never directly connecting Diana to the project. The arrangement was designed to be deniable, and it was. When the book came out, the palace and the press debated its sources with no certainty, and Diana was able to deny direct involvement without technically lying, which was a distinction she'd become quite practiced at maintaining. The recordings themselves are extraordinary documents. Her voice is calm, measured, often strikingly flat in affect, the voice of someone who has practiced saying difficult things until they no longer detonate on contact. She describes the self-harm without flinching. She describes the eating disorder with clinical specificity. She describes the marriage with a precision that is more devastating for being so free of self-pity. She is not performing victimhood. She is giving evidence, and the distinction is important. She understood herself to be building a record, and she built it carefully. The book's publication in June 1992 coincided with a marriage that was by then formally, if not officially, over. Charles and Diana had been living separately in significant ways for years, though the separation had not been announced. The timing was not accidental. Diana understood that the book's appearance would shift the public narrative before the formal announcement of the separation came, and that the narrative as she told it was considerably more sympathetic than any narrative the institution would construct. She was, by this point, operating with the strategic clarity of someone who understood that her only real protection was public opinion, and who was determined to shape it. The palace's response, suggestions of instability, briefings against her, the quiet implication that the woman described in the book was not quite well, played directly into the version of events Diana had preempted by making the tapes in the first place. The question of her mental health, which the institution had used to dismiss and contain her for a decade, was now public, and her account of it was already in print, and the public had read it and largely believed her. The weapon had been turned. Norton later said that Diana, in making the tapes, took the biggest risk of her life. She knew that if they were discovered before publication, the consequences would be severe. She made them anyway. She had decided, somewhere in the autumn of 1991, that silence was no longer acceptable, and she acted on that decision with a precision that the people who had spent a decade describing her as unstable had significantly underestimated. In December 1992, Prime Minister John Major announced to the House of Commons that the Prince and Princess of Wales had separated, which was the official confirmation of what most of the country had suspected for years, and the tabloids had been stating as fact for months. Diana was 31. She moved fully into Kensington Palace and began, in fits and starts, with significant difficulty and occasional spectacular backsliding, the project of figuring out who she was when she wasn't performing being a princess. She started working with a therapist more consistently. She began taking her humanitarian interests seriously as a vocation rather than an obligation. She enrolled in a diploma course. She swam every morning. She called people. She ate dinner with friends and laughed at things and occasionally, carefully, began to seem like someone who might be all right. The separation was, paradoxically, both the worst and the most clarifying thing that could have happened to her. It was the official acknowledgement of the failure of the central structure of her adult life, which is not a small thing to absorb at 31, and it was also the removal of the obligation to maintain the pretense of that structure, which had been consuming an enormous amount of energy for a very long time. She described it later as feeling simultaneously like a disaster and a door opening. Both were true. She restructured her days around what she actually wanted to do. The official engagements continued. She was still Princess of Wales, still a working royal, still maintained a full public schedule, but the ones she selected, the ones she brought her full self to, shifted toward the causes that had always been her primary interest, rather than the ones assigned by the official programme. She increased her hospital visits. She deepened her involvement with the AIDS charities she'd been working with since the late 80s. She began the conversations that would eventually lead to the landmine campaign. She also, during this period, made mistakes. Some of her relationships were unwise. Some of her decisions were governed by loneliness rather than judgment. She was 31 and had never in her adult life been fully in charge of her own choices, and the sudden responsibility of that was not always navigated gracefully. She trusted people who turned out not to be trustworthy. She gave interviews she later regretted. She reached for connection in ways that occasionally gave her enemies material. She was human, in other words, in the particular messy way that humans are when they're trying to reassemble themselves in full view of a watching world. The therapy helped, eventually. She spoke of it with the characteristic directness she brought to things she had found genuinely useful, not as a cure, but as a process, a way of beginning to understand the patterns in herself that had made her vulnerable in the ways she had been vulnerable. She began to recognize the fear of abandonment, the anxiety for approval, the compulsive reaching as things with names and origins and possibly with exits. By 1995, the year of the Panorama interview, she was not healed. The concept of healed is probably not particularly useful here, but she was different. More centered, more deliberate, more in possession of her own story. She was 34. She had 2 sons she adored. She had work that mattered. She had a self that was, for the first time in 15 years, recognisably and entirely hers. On the 5th of November 1995, 23 million British viewers sat down in front of their televisions and watched Princess Diana give an interview to Martin Bashir on BBC Panorama that was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary things that had ever been broadcast in the country. She wore minimal makeup. She had darkened her eyes herself for effect. She looked directly into the camera and described, in measured, careful detail, her bulimia, her self-harm, her husband's infidelity, the institution's indifference to her mental health, and her own relationship, which she acknowledged with a former cavalry officer named James Hewitt. She did not flinch. She cried precisely once, describing her loneliness. The palace did not see it coming. The Queen, it is reported, was not amused. The 23 million viewers mostly were. The interview had been arranged in secrecy over several months, which was becoming something of a specialty of Diana's by this point. Bashir had made contact through an intermediary and had met with Diana privately to discuss the project before anyone at the palace or in her official household was aware it was happening. The filming took place at Kensington Palace on the 3rd of November 1995 on a Sunday, while her protection officers were on reduced duty and her household staff were not informed. The BBC kept it secret until the night before broadcast. The palace found out the day the programme was announced to the press. They had approximately 18 hours. She had prepared for it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that she would not get a second attempt. She knew exactly what she wanted to say, and in what order and with what degree of emphasis. The appearance of spontaneous candour, the pauses, the direct gaze, the precise moment of tears, was not manufactured, but it was also not unconsidered. She'd been building toward this statement for years, and she delivered it with the control of someone who had rehearsed, not the words, but the intention behind them, which is a more reliable form of preparation. The questions Bashir asked were largely the questions that had been circulating in the press for years. The answers Diana gave were the ones nobody had expected her to give publicly, let alone on camera, let alone with that particular quality of stillness. She confirmed the bulimia. Yes, she had suffered from it. Yes, it had been serious. Yes, it had continued for years. She confirmed the self-harm, choosing her words carefully but not evasively. She confirmed that the marriage had broken down irretrievably. She confirmed the affair with James Hewitt, which she described as something she'd been deeply ashamed of, and which she discussed with a directness that wrong-footed the viewers who had expected denial. And then she said the thing that became the sentence. Asked whether she thought she would ever be queen, she said she did not think she would. Asked what role she saw for herself, she said she would like to be a queen in people's hearts, to be someone who was present in the difficult places, who represented those who had no representation, who did the work that the institution had never made room for. It was not a modest ambition. It was also, by any measure, an accurate description of what she had already been doing for 15 years. The palace's response was swift and cold. The Queen wrote to both Charles and Diana within weeks of the broadcast recommending divorce. It was framed as a recommendation rather than a command, which was a courtesy. It was understood by everyone to be neither. Diana had, with 90 minutes of television, made her position within the institution untenable, which was, whether she framed it that way or not, precisely what she had intended. The interview was not a cry for help, it was a declaration. The divorce between Charles and Diana was finalised on the 28th of August 1996, 15 years after the wedding that 750 million people watched and approximately 20 minutes after which things had started going sideways, Diana received a settlement of approximately £17 million, retained her apartments at Kensington Palace, kept her title as Princess of Wales, and was stripped of the designation Her Royal Highness, a detail that was, depending on who you asked, a routine administrative adjustment or a pointed institutional punishment for having embarrassed the crown on national television. Diana described it as a sign. She told friends it clarified things. It removed the last official pretense that she was operating within the institution rather than outside it. And for the first time in her adult life, she found that genuinely liberating. The negotiations over the terms of the divorce were protracted and in places bitter, conducted through lawyers and intermediaries over many months, while both parties continued to undertake public engagements and maintain the careful fiction that their separation had been civilized. The financial settlement was substantial enough to secure her independence and to fund the work she intended to do, which was the element of the negotiation she cared most about. She wanted to be able to operate without institutional permission. The money made that possible. The HR8 question was the one that cut deepest, not because of the title itself, but because of what its removal signified. Her Royal Highness was a designation that entitled her to be bowed or curtsied to, a formal acknowledgement of her status within the family hierarchy. Without it, she was a princess by title, but no longer formally within the structure, no longer owed the gestures of deference that the institution used to mark belonging. Her children retained their HRH designations, she did not. This meant, in the specific peculiar logic of royal protocol, that William and Harry were required to bow to their mother if they wished to show her formal respect. The absurdity of this was not lost on Diana, and was not, she made clear, acceptable to her. She was advised by some to fight the decision publicly. She chose instead to absorb it and move on, which was itself a kind of statement, the statement that she was no longer defining herself by what the institution chose to grant or withhold. She had spent 15 years inside a structure that managed her, contained her, and ultimately tried to erase her, and she had come out of it with her public standing largely intact, her children in her life, her causes advancing, and a clarity about her own purpose that the marriage had never given her. The HRH was a piece of protocol. She was the most recognizable woman in the world. The institution had miscalculated again the relationship between its symbols and actual power. The day the divorce was finalized, she was in London. There was no ceremony, no official acknowledgement. These things are processed in courts, by lawyers, in documents. She went about her day. She was photographed leaving Kensington Palace, and the photographs showed a woman who looked, unmistakably, like someone who had just put something down that had been very heavy. The relief was visible in the way relief sometimes is, not as joy exactly, but as a kind of settling, a reorientation toward ground. She was 35. She was free, in the particular limited way that freedom means something after years of constraint, which is to say, imperfectly and provisionally and more than she had expected. She told a friend shortly after the finalization that she felt for the first time like the author of her own life. The sentence is simple enough to sound like a cliché, and specific enough not to be one. She'd not been the author of her life for a very long time. Now, with the papers signed and the institution formally behind her, she intended to write the next chapters herself. In January 1997, Diana flew to Angola as part of the international campaign to ban landmines and walked through a partially cleared minefield in body armour, with photographers recording every step. The images ran in every newspaper in the world. Conservative politicians in Britain suggested that a princess had no business involving herself in political issues. Deanna suggested, without quite saying it, that she disagreed. She'd been visiting landmine survivors, amputee children in hospitals, rehabilitation centres, and she continued doing it in Bosnia in the months that followed. She was not using the cause. She was committed to it in the specific way she was committed to anything she cared about, completely, personally, with her whole attention on the person in front of her rather than the camera behind her. The Angola visit had been organised in collaboration with the Halo Trust, a demining charity, and with the Red Cross, who had been working on the international campaign to ban anti-personnel landmines. Diana had been introduced to the issue through her charity work and had become increasingly focused on it in the months prior, reading the reports, meeting survivors, understanding the scale of a problem that was killing and maiming civilians, overwhelmingly in countries that had nothing to do with the conflicts that had planted the mines in the first place. She went to Angola not as a figurehead, but as someone who had done the homework. The photographs from the minefield walk were calculated, and she knew they were calculated, and she understood that the calculation was in service of something important rather than something personal, which is the distinction she always made. The image of a princess in a visor and body armour walking through a field where any step could be the last one was designed to bring attention to an issue that was being negotiated in diplomatic circles and generating very little public pressure. She was the public pressure. She understood her own value as an image maker and deployed it in the service of the argument she was making, which was that civilian populations should not continue to be destroyed by weapons they had no part in placing. The political response in Britain was hostile in some quarters. A government minister called her a loose cannon. The tabloid that had spent a decade printing photographs of her face on its front page now suggested she was meddling in matters above her station. Diana responded in the measured way she had developed for responding to institutional criticism, by going to Bosnia in August and doing it again, sitting with survivors, photographing the damage, making the argument in the only way she had consistently found effective, which was to put a human face on a statistic and let the human face do its work. She was not naive about the limits of what she could accomplish personally. She said in interviews during this period that she could not negotiate treaties or pass legislation, that she was aware she was not a politician and did not want to be one. What she could do was make people look at something they had been comfortable not looking at, and she had 15 years of evidence that this was a thing she could do better than almost anyone alive. The campaign succeeded in the end. The Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel landmines was signed in December 1997, 4 months after Diana's death. She did not live to see it. The people who negotiated it acknowledged her contribution directly. Governments that might have held out longer moved faster, because the public pressure she had helped generate made holding out politically untenable. She walked through a minefield in Angola in January, and the treaty was signed in December, and the line between the two is not straight, but it is real. In April 1987, Diana visited an AIDS ward at Middlesex Hospital in London, sat at the bedside of a man dying of AIDS-related illness, and shook his hand without gloves in front of a bank of photographers. This was not a small gesture. In 1987, AIDS was still widely misunderstood as a disease transmitted through casual contact, and the stigma attached to it, particularly for gay men, who constituted the majority of patients in British hospitals, was immense and specific and sometimes brutal. Diana understood exactly what the image would communicate and did it anyway. She continued working with HIV and AIDS charities throughout the rest of her life, visiting patients with the same unhurried attention she brought to everyone, sitting with people who were used to being avoided and treating them as though they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The handshake without gloves was, medically speaking, entirely safe. HIV is not transmitted through casual skin contact. This was known in 1987 to anyone who had read the basic science. It was not, however, widely understood by a public that had been receiving information about AIDS filtered through a media culture that consistently conflated transmission risk with proximity, that had run headlines designed to generate fear rather than understanding, and that had created around AIDS patients a social quarantine of avoidance and judgment that was causing real and measurable harm to real and measurable people. Diana's handshake cut through this. A single image of a princess, not a doctor, not an activist, not someone whose professional role required proximity to illness, choosing freely to take the hand of a dying man and sit with him and look at him, directly communicated something that years of public health messaging had not managed to convey. That these were people, and that being near them was not dangerous, and that the avoidance was a choice rather than a necessity, and that different choices were possible. She returned, "This is the detail that matters most in some ways. It would have been possible to make the gesture once and move on to other causes, and the gesture would still have had its impact." She went back. She visited the wards repeatedly, quietly, often without photographers, sitting with patients who'd been told by their families not to come home, who had been abandoned by the people who were supposed to love them, who were dying in institutional beds with the specific loneliness of people who had become, to the world outside, invisible. She sat with them and held their hands and stayed. The gay community's response to her work was profound and lasting. In a period when the government's public response to the AIDS crisis was inadequate, and the public atmosphere around gay men was hostile in ways that are hard to fully reconstruct now, Diana's repeated, visible, personal engagement with AIDS patients constituted a form of public endorsement that went considerably beyond the official charitable description of her involvement. She was not simply fundraising. She was saying, with her presence and her touch, that these lives mattered, and that the people living and dying inside them deserved to be seen. She spoke about the work in interviews with the characteristic combination of simplicity and precision she brought to the thing she cared about most, that these people needed to know someone was there, that the practical support of the charities mattered, but the human presence mattered at least as much, that nobody should die alone if it was within anyone's power to prevent it. She visited HIV and AIDS patients until the last year of her life. She sat with people who were dying. She held their hands. She stayed. In the years following the separation, Diana's daily life settled into a rhythm that bore almost no resemblance to the popular imagination of how a princess spent her days. She woke early. She swam in the Buckingham Palace pool at dawn, the only quiet hour she reliably had to herself. She returned to Kensington Palace, where her apartments were decorated in a style she'd chosen herself, cream and peach, and rather more comfortable than palatially grand. She answered her own phone. She made her own cups of tea in her own kitchen. She had a small staff she was devoted to and who were devoted back. She read in the evenings, newspapers and psychology books primarily. She watched television. She ordered takeaway curry and ate it while reading the papers, which is perhaps the most relatable thing about her, and she knew it. Kensington Palace sounds, from the outside, like an improbable setting for an ordinary life. It is, after all, a royal palace, a substantial 17th century building set in the western edge of Hyde Park, surrounded by formal gardens and inhabited historically by members of the royal family and their households. But Diana's apartments, numbers 8 and 9 in the palace complex, had been furnished over the years to reflect what she actually liked, which was warmer and less intimidating than the official palatial aesthetic. There were comfortable sofas. There were photographs of her boys everywhere. There were flowers, always. She was particular about flowers, and the staff knew it. It was, within its unusual setting, genuinely a home. She was a morning person, which surprised some people given the impression of her as someone who found the days difficult. The early swim was non-negotiable. She had swum competitively as a girl and returned to it seriously in the post-separation years. treating the early morning lengths as the foundation of her day in the way that some people treat coffee and some people treat prayer. She said it cleared her head. She did it alone, at an hour when the pool was empty and the solitude was deliberate. She cooked sometimes for herself and for friends, simple things, pasta and salads, the cooking of someone who had learned as a young woman sharing a flat in Earl's Court, rather than someone who'd grown up with a household kitchen staff. She ate at the kitchen table when the boys were with her, not in the formal dining room. She watched whatever was on television in the evenings. She liked chat shows, she liked the news. She reportedly liked a particular brand of American soap opera, which she watched without any apparent embarrassment about liking it. She talked on the phone a great deal. Friends, charity contacts, journalists she trusted. Though trust was a complicated currency in her world, her therapist, her sons when they were at school. She was, by the accounts of those she called, a good phone presence, warm, funny, genuinely interested in what was happening in the lives of the people she called, not simply using the call to manage her own state. She asked about children and partners and problems and followed up on things mentioned in previous calls, which is the phone equivalent of the attention she brought to rooms. The staff who worked for her during these years, Paul Burrell, her butler, and the small household team around him, described a domestic environment that was, by the standards of a royal household, unusually relaxed and unusually warm. She knew their names, their families, their concerns. She brought them tea sometimes, which was not the direction the tea was supposed to flow. She was, in her own home, simply a person with considerable pressures and a complicated public life, but a person who wanted the space she lived in to feel like somewhere she actually belonged. The summer of 1997 was the summer Diana allowed herself, for the first time in a long while, to simply enjoy her life without particularly calculating what it looked like. She had the boys, she had her work, she had friends. She went on holiday aboard Mohammed Al Fayed's yacht, and there met his son Dodi, and whatever the precise nature of what developed between them, the tabloids went considerably further than the evidence supported. She appeared by all accounts happy. She was 36. She was in the process of restructuring her charitable commitments. She had just returned from a landmine survey trip in Bosnia. She had plans. She had, by the testimony of almost everyone who saw her that summer, a quality of settled energy that those closest to her had not seen before. She looked like someone who had figured something out. The Al Fayed connection had come through William and Harry's summer holiday arrangements. Mohammed Al Fayed had offered his villa in the south of France and his yacht, the Jonakal, and Diana had accepted, bringing the boys in late July for what became a widely photographed and much speculated upon Mediterranean holiday. The paparazzi photographs of Diana on the yacht were among the most circulated images of that summer. She was in a swimsuit, she was tanned, she was laughing, she was visibly relaxed in a way that photographs of her in earlier years rarely captured. Dodi Fayed was 41, a film producer whose credits included Chariots of Fire, charming and attentive and from a world, international wealthy entirely outside the British establishment. That was a relief to Diana rather than a complication. He was not connected to the institution. He had no stake in the official narrative. He was not going to brief against her or manage her or suggest that her behaviour was problematic. He was simply, by the evidence available, kind to her, which remained a quality she responded to powerfully, and which had not always been in abundant supply. Whether the relationship was serious, whether there was an engagement planned, whether Diana intended to leave England permanently, these questions became the obsessive focus of tabloid and documentary speculation for years afterward and remain genuinely unresolved. People who knew her well disagree. The simplest and most supportable answer is that it was new and it was pleasant, and she had not yet decided what it was, which is the condition of most relationships at 2 months, and does not require a definitive interpretation. What is clear is that she was moving forward. She'd been in conversation with the British Red Cross about restructuring her official charitable role. She'd begun discussions about the next phase of the landmine campaign. She had spoken to friends about wanting to move some of her base of operations abroad, to have more flexibility, to be less permanently in the sightline of a British press that had made her daily existence into a continuous documentary. She was 36 and she had, against considerable odds, built a life that was largely hers, and she was thinking about what to do with the next part of it. She kissed William and Harry goodbye at the end of August. They went to Balmoral with their father. She flew to Paris. She had dinner at the Ritz with Dodie on the 31st of August. She did not come home. She had plans for September. The plans did not happen. The summer ended as suddenly and as incomprehensibly as anything had ever ended, and the world, which had been watching her for 16 years, woke up to find her gone. On the 31st of August 1997, in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, a car travelling at high speed, pursued by paparazzi photographers, crashed into the 13th pillar of the underpass. Dodi Fayed was killed instantly. The driver, Henri Paul, was also killed. Diana survived the initial impact and was alive when emergency services reached the car. She died at the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital at 4 a.m, local time, from internal injuries sustained in the crash. She was 36 years old. Back in England, the night was quiet and warm and ordinary. By morning, it was not. Flowers began appearing at the gates of Kensington Palace before sunrise, brought by people who had gotten up in the dark to do something, even if the only thing was to leave something behind. The evening had begun at the Ritz Hotel on the Place Vendôme, where Diana and Dodi had dined in the hotel restaurant after an afternoon of paparazzi activity that had made a number of other plans untenable. The photographers had been following them throughout the day, at Dodi's apartment, at a jewellery shop, through the streets of Paris. By the time they left the Ritz shortly after midnight, the decision had been made to travel by a rear exit, using a decoy car at the front of the hotel while they slipped out through the back in a different vehicle. The pursuing photographers followed anyway. The Mercedes carrying them entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at a speed subsequently estimated at between 90 and 100 kilometers per hour. The crash was the result of a combination of factors: excessive speed, a driver who was found to have been drinking, the pursuing motorcycles and cars, the narrow tunnel, the concrete pillar, and the question of which factor was primary became the subject of an investigation that concluded in France in 1999 and in Britain in 2008, both of which returned verdicts of accidental death caused by grossly negligent driving. She was still alive in the car when the first responders reached it. She was extracted carefully with great difficulty and worked on at the scene for an extended period before being transferred to the hospital. The French medical system operates on a different protocol to the British one, treating at the scene for longer before moving the patient, and the journey to the hospital took approximately 40 minutes. She was in cardiac arrest by the time she arrived, and despite prolonged resuscitation efforts, she could not be saved. The time of death was recorded as 4 minutes past 4 in the morning. The news reached Britain through the early morning news programmes, in the particular disbelieving way that genuinely unexpected news arrives, requiring repetition before it settles into comprehension. People woke to it. People heard it from other people. The palace and the government were informed through official channels in the hours before public announcement. William and Harry were at Balmoral and were told by their father. They were 15 and 12 years old. The flowers at Kensington Palace gates were the first visible sign of what was coming. People arriving in the early hours with something to put down, with something to do in the face of something that had no adequate response. By the end of that day, the flowers covered the ground for meters in every direction. By the end of the week, they would extend so far that the scent of them was detectable from the road. The world was trying, in the only language available to it to say something that language could not quite contain. The week between Diana's death and her funeral on the 6th of September, 1997 was one of the stranger episodes in modern British history, a collective public grief so large and so visceral that it appeared to genuinely surprise the nation itself. Flowers accumulated outside the palaces in quantities that had to be managed by council workers. Queues to sign the condolence books stretched for miles. The tabloids that had made their fortunes photographing her turned with considerable speed on the paparazzi who had been chasing the car. The Queen remained at Balmoral for several days, which the public found intolerable, and the pressure to return to London, to acknowledge, to visibly grieve, became so intense that the monarchy's survival was, in some analyses of that week, a genuinely open question. The scale of the public response was without modern precedent in Britain. The estimate of flowers left at the various royal palaces during that week runs to several million individual bouquets, cellophane wrapped and handwritten, noted and stacked so deep that the gates of Kensington Palace disappeared behind them entirely. The condolence books that were opened at St James's Palace were filled and replaced and filled again. By the end of the week, books had been opened at sites across the country, and the lines to sign them stretched for hours. People waited patiently, holding their children's hands to write a sentence to a woman most of them had never met. This is the thing about the grief of that week that is hardest to explain to anyone who didn't live inside it. It was not the performed grief of national occasion, not the public mourning that attends the passing of monarchs and statesmen in the formal ceremonial way. It was personal. People cried who didn't expect to cry, who would have told you the week before that they did not have strong feelings about Diana. Something had been lost that they had not known they were depending on until it was gone. Something about the sense that there was a person in the public eye who was paying genuine attention, who was present in the difficult places, who understood suffering from the inside rather than from a ceremonial distance. The royal family's response, or apparent lack of it, became the crisis within the crisis. The Queen and Prince Philip and Charles and the boys remained at Balmoral, in the Scottish Highlands, away from London, away from the public gathering of grief. The flag above Buckingham Palace flew at its normal position. There was at that time no protocol for flying it at half-mast for a non-monarch, a fact that became, in the mood of that week, a symbol of institutional coldness rather than a procedural detail. The press turned, the public turned. The tabloids that had spent 16 years printing Diana's face on their front pages now printed headlines about a monarchy failing to mourn. The Queen returned to London on the 5th of September, the day before the funeral. She stopped to look at the flowers. She gave a live television broadcast that acknowledged Diana's qualities directly and with evident feeling. The first time, many noted, that the Queen had spoken publicly about Diana in a register that felt personal rather than official. The broadcast steadied things. The monarchy survived the week. But the week had shown something real about the gap between the institution and the country it represented. A gap that Diana, for all the difficulty she had caused, had been quietly bridging for 15 years, and whose absence was now suddenly, unmistakably visible. On the 6th of September 1997, Diana's funeral was attended by approximately 2 billion television viewers worldwide, a number so large it ceases to function as a statistic and begins to function as a fact about the species. The cortege passed through streets lined with people who had waited overnight. Elton John sang a revised version of Candle in the Wind. Her brother, Charles Spencer, delivered a eulogy that addressed the institution directly, which no one had quite expected, and which received applause from the crowd outside the abbey that rippled in through the walls. William and Harry walked behind the coffin, with their father and their grandfather and their uncle, and the world watched and understood, in the specific wordless way that some things are understood, what that walk cost. The the coffin left Kensington Palace in the morning, passing through streets that had been filling since the early hours with people standing in silence, holding flowers, crying quietly or not crying at all, but simply being there, being present in the way Diana had always been present with people, as a form of witness. It travelled through Hyde Park and along the Mall to Westminster Abbey, a route of approximately 3 miles that took a considerable time because of the crowds and because of the pace of the procession, which was slow enough for the silence to settle around it properly. The walk behind the coffin was William and Harry's idea, or rather it became theirs. They had initially been uncertain. Charles had supported whatever they chose, and they chose to walk. Harry was 12 years old, William was 15. They walked for the entire route in public, behind their mother's coffin, in front of 2 billion people. People along the route who'd been waiting for hours in the quiet determination of genuine mourning, looked at the 2 boys walking and wept in the specific way of people recognizing something they have no adequate response to. Inside the Abbey, Elton John performed. He had been a friend of Diana's in her later years. She had attended his concerts. He had attended her charity galas. The friendship was real rather than strategic. He had originally planned to sing Candle in the Wind in its original form, but in the days after her death rewrote the lyric with his collaborator Bernie Taupin to address Diana directly. The song, performed on an instrument that had been moved into the Abbey for the occasion, in a space designed for the echo of formal music rather than the intimate address of a pop lyric, produced in the assembled congregation and in the 2 billion people watching something that can only be described as a shared dissolution, the point at which the ceremony of grief gave way to the thing itself. Charles Spencer's eulogy was the moment the mourning changed register. He spoke of his sister with genuine knowledge and genuine love, and then, midway through, he turned to address the institution directly, pledging that the Spencer family would ensure William and Harry were raised with the values Diana had held, in a world of imagination and empathy, rather than duty and deference. The words were received outside the Abbey before they were received inside it. The applause from the crowd in Hyde Park, where the service was being broadcast on large screens, came through the Abbey walls like something physical. The congregation, which contained the entire senior royal family, began to applaud too. It was, by any measure, one of the more extraordinary moments in the history of a building not short of extraordinary moments. What Diana left behind is, in some ways, easier to measure than what she was. She left behind 2 sons who have her eyes, and her warmth, and in different ways her willingness to speak about things the institution would prefer remain unspoken. She left behind a shift in how the royal family publicly related to people, a gradual, incomplete, but real softening of the official manner that had once made handshakes a formal exercise rather than a human one. She left behind an understanding demonstrated through decades of personal presence in hospitals and crisis centres and minefields, that attention is a form of care, that showing up, actually showing up and looking directly at the person in front of you is not a performance of compassion, but the thing itself. She changed, in ways that are still being mapped, what it is permissible to say about what it costs to live inside an institution that was never designed around the person living in it. The sons are the most visible and the most living part of her legacy. William and Harry both carry in different configurations the imprint of what she valued, the directness about mental health that Harry has brought to his public work, the warmth in the crowd that William inherited with such fidelity that photographs of him crouching to speak to a child at a walkabout produce in long-time observers a specific and complicated feeling. They are their own people, with their own lives and their own choices, but the things Diana worked hardest to give them, the sense that the world outside the palace existed and mattered, the capacity for genuine human connection, the permission to acknowledge difficulty rather than suppress it. These are visible in who they are, and they will be visible in their children after them. The royal family changed too, imperfectly and gradually, and with the institutional reluctance that attends all change in that particular organisation. The gloves came off, figuratively, and in some cases literally. The distances shortened. The official manner softened in ways that would have been unrecognisable to the monarchy of 1981. Whether this is tribute or adaptation, or simply the pressure of a watching world with a higher tolerance for formality than it used to have, is a matter for debate. What is not debatable is that the public expectation of what a member of the royal family does when they are in a crowd, that they engage, that they listen, that they remain for longer than is strictly necessary, was shaped significantly by 16 years of Diana doing it, and the world's response to her doing it. The mental health legacy is perhaps the least visible and the most consequential. She talked publicly about her eating disorder in 1995 on Panorama, when eating disorders were still heavily stigmatized, and the connection between mental illness and personal failure was still widely assumed rather than challenged. The letters she received afterward numbered in the thousands, from people who had never told anyone, for whom the act of a public figure naming the experience from the inside was the first moment the experience had felt survivable. This is a measurable thing. This changed things. She was not perfect. She was not uncomplicated. She was a person who had been shaped by damage as much as by gift, who made mistakes, who could be difficult and demanding and occasionally reckless, who was operating without a map in a territory that had no maps because nobody who had ever walked it had been allowed to describe it. She did what she could with what she had in the time she had, and what she could do turned out to be considerably more than anyone who underestimated her, and there were many who underestimated her, had anticipated. She was 36 when she died, which is the age at which most people are just beginning to understand what they are actually capable of. The decades she did not have would have been remarkable. The decades she did have already were. She walked into a minefield in Angola in January of her last year, and she sat at bedsides and she held hands and she looked directly at the cameras when the cameras needed looking at, and she raised 2 sons who bow their heads at her grave and carry her forward into a world she helped, in her specific and irreplaceable way, to make a little less cold. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. And so here we are, at the end of a life that was, by any measure, too short and too watched and too complicated to be reduced to a fairy tale, though the world tried for a long time to reduce it to exactly that. Think about what she carried. She arrived at 19 into a building she didn't know, wearing a suit that was slightly too big, smiling at cameras she had no training to manage, trying to become something she had no blueprint for. She did it without a manual, without adequate support, without the simple basic kindness of someone sitting her down and saying, "This is hard and we know it is hard and we are here." She did it anyway. She was not a saint. She was better than that. She was a person, a specific and complicated and sometimes difficult and frequently extraordinary person who found in her own wounds the precise instrument she needed to reach other people's. The child who stood at the end of a driveway listening for a car that didn't come back became the woman who drove herself to hospitals and sat at bedsides and stayed. The girl who learned to read a room for signs of unhappiness became the woman who could walk into a ward full of dying people and make each one of them feel briefly and genuinely less alone. The damage became the gift. The loss became the compass. She changed what it is permissible to feel in public. She changed what it is permissible to say about suffering, about institutions, about the cost of performing a life rather than living one. She shook hands without gloves in 1987, and the world shifted slightly on its axis. She walked into a minefield in 1997, and people who had been comfortable not looking began to look. She sat in front of a camera in 1995 and named her own pain with such steadiness that millions of people watching felt, for the first time, that theirs had a name too. She left behind 2 boys who loved her. She left behind a world that was, in small and measurable ways, less cruel than it might otherwise have been. She left behind the particular instruction, demonstrated rather than spoken, that showing up is itself an act of love. That presence, real presence, the kind where you put your phone away and you look at the person in front of you and you stay, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole thing. So tonight, as you settle into the warmth of wherever you are, the clean sheets, the quiet room, the ordinary comfortable safety of a life that is entirely your own, maybe hold that for a moment. The extraordinary ordinary miracle of being here, unhurried, unobserved, free to simply rest. She would have liked that for you. She would have liked that for herself too. Sleep well.